Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about getting your organization ready for artificial intelligence, which of course includes making sure your AI system is fed enough data, enough quality data. To discuss that, I'm joined by a real expert in the field. With me is Bob Friday, CTO of Juniper's AI-driven enterprise business. Bob, very good to have you with us today.
Yeah, no, James, thank you for having me here. AI is, a topic dear to my heart, so it's really great to be here with you today.
Great. There's a really interesting report about the state of artificial intelligence. It seems like there's a bit of a gap between some of the hopes and some of the optimism for AI and some of the reality of how it's actually getting deployed. That's actually a report. I think it's either sponsored or put together by Juniper. It'd be nice for me to do a little screen share and show the stats for it, which I think is. Let me do this
Yeah.
kind of advanced technology, the Zoom screen sharing. Here we go. Let's do share. Yeah, and if I look at this, it's interesting. So we look at the figures. The survey found that 95% of 700 respondents believe that their organizations would benefit from embedding AI into their daily operations. So everyone really wants to do it. On the other hand, this compares with only 6% of C-level leaders who have reported adoption of AI-powered solutions across their organization. So there's a real disconnect between the optimism, the hope for AI, and what people want it to do or think it can do, and the reality of how it's deployed. What's going on there to create that gap?
Yeah, James, when you look at it, I used to be the mobility CTO at Cisco, right? And we
Right.
really started, what I heard there is really from customers. There's a couple of things those customers really were looking to do. One is they really wanted to they wanted to basically get their systems to stop crashing, but they really wanted end-to-end visibility, from the client to the cloud. And that's really when AI ops started to become more critical. And what I really noticed was, and that's one reason I left Cisco to start Mist, right? Is because what was really happening was to build an AI ops solution, you really needed to have kind of a real-time pipeline to deal with the data, right? It
Okay.
was basically an architectural change that was happening. From what I did 20 years ago at Airspace, we built systems that were helping enterprises manage network elements.
Hmm.
Really the paradigm shift is really now helping enterprises really manage the end-to-end user experience. And that really requires you to change two things. Technically, it requires something in the cloud that can actually process this data real time. Now,
Right.
the other interesting twist I found in this is really it requires almost an organizational change, right?
A cultural change, I'm assuming.
A cultural change in both the customer and in the vendors, right? So at Mist, what we ended up doing was I ended up really tying my data science team up to my customer support team.
Hmm.
Because one of the challenges is, we have data scientists who, they understand the math and the science behind the ML algorithms, but they're not necessarily network domain experts. So
Hmm.
you look at the challenges here, you got the vendors who've got to change their culture. We got to move to architectures that can actually do AI ML, and you got to
Mhm.
organizationally change on the vendor side. And then on the customer side, the customers have to basically start changing their IT teams, right? They're going through a bunch of changes on the IT side. You look
Mhm.
at IT teams, we're asking IT teams to do almost an exponential change in
Right.
how they operate their networks.
Yeah. You mean because of the level of data, in other words.
Well, the complexity, right? I mean, you look at
Yeah.
what's happening on that side, their networks are getting more complex. And we're asking IT guys to basically go from being CLI programmers to being Python programmers, right?
Hmm.
So they're already making that shift to becoming Python programmers. And now we're asking them to become AI data scientist experts, right? So that's a
Right.
lot of pressure on our customers right now and getting their IT team skill sets up to the next
Well,
stage.
you mentioned AI ops, so this is really is that a key area of yours in particular, especially in terms of dealing with the complexity and data and the data in the IT operations? Are you big at AI ops in particular?
I mean, that is what we do here right now. And
That
that's really the change, right? AI ops is really that paradigm shift from managing network elements to managing client to cloud, right? I
right.
really don't care what's between the client and the cloud, whether it's Juniper equipment or someone else's equipment. My mission in life is really to help them figure out why their devices and customers are having problems, poor internet connectivity.
Let's talk about the AI the AI ops market for a second. How do you think is it close to mainstream or is it still in its infancy in terms of adoption? What would you say?
I think right now we're really in the early days of AI ops adoption,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
You look at enterprises and businesses, like we mentioned before. I mean, culturally, they're trying to get their IT teams, with the right skill sets to really embrace AI, and they're really trying to understand, what's the difference between AI and automation.
Right.
And from my perspective, AI is really just the next step in the evolution of automation, right?
Hmm.
What we're really doing is we're really building solutions on par that can do things on par with humans now, right? It's kind of like the
Right.
self-driving car, diagnosing cancers. And if you look really, one of the inspirations at Mist, right? One of the reasons I started Mist was, when I saw Watson play Jeopardy. I don't know,
Oh,
you remember,
really?
right?
Yeah. No,
So
it was a big deal yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
that's when I kind of realized, hey, if they can build something that can play Jeopardy,
Right.
we should be able to build something that can basically answer questions and manage networks on par with network domain experts, right? It's like, the
Right.
technology is real. We've gone from marketing hype to that there is real technology here that we can actually build something that can do something on par with the human.
Well, it's true, but in terms of the winning at Jeopardy, that's spitting back out information, which of course is going to be and handling information, processing information, which is going to be one of the cores of AI ops. But it's also, I think about those IT experts, they're making nuanced decisions. They're actually having to forecast things. In a sense, we need AI ops to do more than just spit out the information. We need prediction and forecasting. We almost need the system to be giving us a little bit of advice. Am I correct in
Right.
that?
Well,
Yeah.
and that's what we're starting to see, right? I mean, we're starting to see systems now that can actually predict hardware failures or find RMA failures inside of the
Right.
network, right? So
Hmm.
the days of, where you used to have to argue with your vendor about, whether or not you're having a hardware software problem, those
Right.
days are going away because these more intelligent systems, they know whether or not it's a hardware problem, software problem. So my transition from what I did 20 years ago at aerospace, where basically a customer would have to send a bunch of information to convince me it was a hardware problem. We are
Right.
now we're sending RMAs out, right? Customers don't
Hmm.
have to wait for me. We can basically tell them, yes, we know that you have a hardware problem. Please send it back. Or other use cases like bad cables. We've gotten down to the point now we can actually find these needle in the haystack bad cable problems where we're 90% or better accurate, where IT departments now can say, hey, I trust you.
Oh,
Hey,
okay.
don't bother me. Or if you find a bad cable, issue the support ticket and move on. So those are kind of cases where we're starting to see AI and ML really take on this next level of automation, right? Helping offload IT tasks onto these AI solutions.
So what is the name of the AI ops solutions that actually can find a bad cable amid all those cables in the data center? Is there a specific
Yeah.
solution that does that?
Well, I mean, so Juniper, we call it Marvis.
Okay.
If you dig under the hood and actually look at it, you'll see something called logistic regression. So that's kind of the actual ML algorithm that's
Okay.
down in the under the hood there is actually making the determination whether or not you have a bad cable or not.
Hmm. Interesting. Let's talk about the data challenges. What data challenges do organizations need to address in order to quickly inform AI systems? Because of course they need to be fed the right
Right.
data. How do companies do that?
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, like I said back when we started Mist, right? I mean, one of the questions when we started Mist was, should we actually build an access point or not, right? And when I made the decision back then was, I wanted to build the access point not because I thought the market needed another wireless access point. It's because I really want to make sure I can get the data I need to answer a question. So
Mm-hmm.
when I look at most enterprises right now, the mistake they're making is they tend to focus all their energy on trying to build big data lakes, data warehouses, without really starting with the question, right? And so usually
Okay.
the advice I give people is like, hey, if you're going to work on an AI ops, AI type of problem, you really start with the question you're trying to answer. In our case, it was we're trying to answer the question of why are you having poor internet connectivity?
Hmm.
Right? And so that really starts with making sure you get the data from the edge of the network. If you start with that, then it starts to drive to make sure you get the data you need to answer the question you're trying to answer.
So the idea is make sure you know your question, your sort of guiding, leading question, as opposed to merely buying technology.
Right. Or trying to pile data in a data lake, right? I mean, you see a lot of enterprises, the first thing they try to do is they try to take every piece of data they have and start, sticking into Splunk or sticking into some big data warehouse. And then they find out they're not using 95% of the data never gets used for much of anything.
Right. It is amazing the small amount of data that is actually mined for competitive advantage. I mean, I think it's sort of the story of our time is that we have an ocean of data, but we're using just a small portion of it to really navigate.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would add, if you look at the question, right, as we've got, what we're doing now is we're starting to expand across different data sources, right? When we started, it was basically getting data from access points to answer the connectivity question. Now we're getting data from the clients, their visibility of the network. We're getting data from the switches and the routers,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
as you start to get more data, it lets you answer more questions. Like when we get data from the SD-WAN router, it starts to let us answer questions about applications and services. And we start to be able to answer questions with more granularity. And then you can
Mm.
start doing proactively fix it. Once you have data from the switches, if we see a misconfigured VLAN, we can actually proactively correct that without bothering the IT teams.
Right. Right. We talked about this a little bit beforehand, the idea of a common telemetry standard. So, why does there need to be a common telemetry standard to make obtaining data for AI easier? Why is that important in your view?
Well, I think it's important. I think that's one friction point we see in the adoption of AI is, are we really going to get to a common language where every vendor uses the same, format for time?
Hmm.
Um, I think that's probably a little hard. I think what is probably required in the industry is if we get everyone to kind of agree to how to store data away. When we look at, what question or what problem we're trying to solve, you may have to get data from your access vendor, right? And you may have to get
Hmm.
data from your WAN router vendor, and you may have to get some data from your application vendor in really to answer an end-to-end type of question. So I
Hmm.
think what's more important in the industry right now is, can we at least get people to agree on how they're going to store the data away in these cloud solutions? Because if you look where we're headed, right, the industry is moving to kind of cloud first direction, right? We're
Right.
almost, all the data you need is being stored away. Your different vendors are storing this data for you on your behalf in different clouds. So it's more important about getting the data stored away in some sort of descriptive format that AI and BI can actually access and understand how the data is being stored.
Hmm. Is it realistic to think that there would be an industry standard in terms of that, or is it inevitable, or is it a long shot in your view?
I, I think it's inevitable. I think we're in the early days of AI. And so I think people are just now fully starting to
Right.
appreciate the fact. And I think a lot of the AI efforts are being kind of focused on very narrow efforts where the data is, coming from one source or one vendor.
Right.
So I think as AI expands, especially AI ops and networking expands across networking, we'll start to see the industry move to more industry standards. Like, on the switch side, we moved to open config, right? That was kind of a standard effort to
Hmm.
get the switches managed, I think. So I do
Right.
think start to see the industry move to kind of more standard ways of getting telemetry data from different devices, especially on
Hmm.
streaming, right? Pulling and
Hmm.
pushing. We're going to
Streaming
see
data, you
more
mean? Yeah.
streaming data. You look at AI. In the past, 20 years ago, it was all SNMP, right? We were basically pulling all these devices to get stats and information out of our devices. As we move into more of a real-time AI environment, it's more about I want things to be streamed to me in real time. I don't want to have to go
Hmm.
pull things. I want to have telemetry come at me. So that's
Right.
probably more important that we get that standardized as opposed to actually trying to describe each little field in the schema.
Right. Let's look to the future for a second. I think specifically the future, not of overall AI necessarily, but first the future of AI apps in particular. When you look at the definition of AI apps, it's artificial intelligence for IT operations, and that's really the commonly accepted one. I think Gartner made that up in 2017. Um, but I think about there's obviously going to be an AI platform that runs the entire enterprise from sales to IT to HR, and it's all going to be one platform. So really, the idea of AI apps, which are AI for IT operations, is going to be consumed into a larger AI framework. True, false, or what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of concepts here. One of them is this AI. For me personally, like I said, AI is really about trying to do something on par with a human.
Right.
Whether it's driving cars or detecting cancer medically. For networking, it's more about, can we build something that does something on par with network domain experts?
Mm.
And I think the future is, and my common things. I think you and I probably grew up. I don't know if you remember watching Star Trek when you were a kid, right?
I do. Yep, definitely.
And almost every technology that was in Star Trek 30, 40 years ago has now, except for except for the transporter, right? The transporter,
Right.
I'm not sure we're going to live to see that. But
Yeah.
the computer, remember the computers? Like,
Oh,
computer, tell me
oh, definitely. Yeah. No, it's here. Yeah.
that. So I think we are going to see that in our future, where network IT teams are going to have an AI assistant on their team.
Right.
That's going to make it easier for them to diagnose and run and maintain these networks, just like we
Mhm.
saw in Star Trek, right? And
Hmm.
this is what I call the transition, to conversational interfaces.
Hmm.
You
Right.
remember the industry, when we were younger, it's all about CLIs, right? We're basically programming and maintaining all these switches and routers,
Hmm.
becoming CLI jockeys, and then we kind of moved to the dashboard, the GUI dashboards for running and manage our networks. I
Right.
think we're now in that transition to conversational interfaces are just a much easier way for network IT teams to actually manage and extract data and
Hmm.
visibility out of their networks. So I
Hmm.
think that's kind of the future of what I call AI in networking, is the virtual system. Think Star Trek, think computer.
Hmm.
You're going to start to see virtual systems become a key element in most of these network IT teams in the future.
So that means that NLP will be really at the center of it all, so that the IT expert can speak to his or her machine.
Yeah, the NLP is a great example right now of these conversations, and that's an area that's changing as we speak right now. I mean, I can tell you there are things that we can do now with the conversational interfaces that we couldn't do 2 years ago, right?
Hmm.
So that technology is evolving, is still evolving right now.
Right. So what about the future of AI ops specifically? If you look into this, I know they're expecting something like 15 to 20% annual growth in revenues, from about 17 billion now to about 40 billion in the year 2026, based on, I think, IDC numbers. What do you see in terms of the future of AI ops specifically going forward?
Yeah, so specifically, in the short term, I think right now we're going to see, as I said, data. Data is
Right.
going to be I think it's going to happen in phases, and data is probably the first phase. Where enterprises are working on making sure they can get the data that they need to solve some AI ops problem.
Right.
And as we discussed earlier, right? So, I make a barrel of wine every year, and same
Red wine or
analogy,
white wine?
red wine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, but same saying, right? Great wine starts with great grapes, great AI,
Yes.
the great data. And so
Right.
that's probably the first phase of the journey that most people are going to get on, is get that down. And then
Hmm.
you got to really get that data into a framework that you can actually start applying ML to. And that's
Hmm.
kind of that real-time pipeline. So that's
Hmm.
kind of the future I see, the journey onto the adoption of AI ops into, ultimately, before I retire, I suspect we're going to start to see these virtual AI assistants become a mainstream of the IT teams of the future.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that particular one is too far away, actually. That could be in the next couple, 2, 3 years, I would think.
As
Yay
I
or
said,
nay?
before I retire, right? So
Okay, good. Bob, I think you've said it. There's a lot more to say, but I think we're good for today. I greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. Thank you very much.
yeah, great to be here, James.